Alright, so these are Ecology 2 Biology Remote Notes, and this is B12C Part 2. And since this is the fourth time I've tried to do this, I'm not rewriting the notes, I'm just going to be talking about them as we go through. So we're going to take the second half of your page on B12C, and we've split it in half here, and we're going to start down here. When we talk about these food pyramids, we can talk about them in terms of several things. First and foremost, we can talk about them in terms of food. What types of food is eaten, and what organisms are the eaters. So we could talk about them in terms of carnivores, omnivores, herbivores. We can talk about the types of food. Are they plant eaters and stuff like in terms of things like that. Another way we can talk about, or we can use this food web, is in terms of biomass. And biomass refers to all of the mass of the organisms at that level. So if we look at the producers, let's say we're just talking about a population of grasses, then we would get all of those grasses, measure the mass of them, and that's the biomass of those organisms at that level here. So we can talk about it in terms of biomass. We can talk about it in terms of energy, the amount of energy available to move on to the next level. So here at the first level up here, that's 100% of the energy. You have that written down. All of that 100% of the energy is eaten by the primary consumer. However, a lot of that's used up. He eats the food to get the energy, but 90% of that is used up by this primary consumer's body. And that means only 10% of what we started with is available to move on to the third tier up here. This guy, out of the 100% of the food that he gets, then he's going to use 90% of that, and what's going to happen is in his body is only 10% left. So this number is referring to the amount of energy that you started out with. So here's 100%. This is 10% that made it into the body of the primary consumer, which the secondary consumer eats. And of that leftover 10%, only 1% makes it into the body of the secondary consumer. And that means it's a part of his body, muscles, bones, tissue, things like that. And then when this one gets eaten, they take all of that, what's left over, and they use up all of it, but only 0.1% is left inside the body to actually become a part of the body. And that would be, if we had a quaternary producer, that would be able to go to that next one. So we can talk about it in terms of energy. We can talk about it in terms of numbers, just sheer numbers of organisms. How many organisms are at each level when you go up here? And usually it's kind of like we think of it as a food chain in this sense. So there are X number of organisms here. There are fewer organisms here, if you think compared to grasses and cows. And then up here we have fewer organisms in the cows and so on. So we can talk about it in terms of numbers of organisms too. So you can get the different shapes of the pyramids. How long they are compared to each other can vary greatly depending on what type of thing you're talking about here. Now, one thing we need to talk about are decomposers. And decomposers are those organisms that break down dead material. They break down dead material, or they feed on dead material. They're bacteria, fungi, protists, all those things can be decomposers. We just make the assumption that they're all throughout the charts, because no matter at what level, if an organism dies or gets rid of wastes, they're going to be the next thing in line would be the decomposers that deal with that. So they break down dead material, they feed on dead material. Examples are bacteria, fungi, protists, and there's a special type of decomposer that we call a detritivore. And these detritivores feed on decaying organic material. Think about leaf litter, or underneath trees and bushes where you have this really rich soil where it's got a bunch of dead leaves that fall. You know, if you have an organism that drops its leaves every season, it's got a lot of decayed plant material, and it's not really dirt. It's in the process of becoming dirt. And so we call it humus or detritus or something along those lines. And you'll find lots of organisms that are specialized feeders. These are organisms like earthworms, and I don't know if you call them pill bugs or roly-polies, but those are types of organisms we're talking about there. These are detritivores. Remember that suffix vor means to eat, and then detrita means it's talking about dead material here in this case. So they feed on decaying organic material, dead leaves, feces, and examples of these are earthworms, pill bugs. Ants will do this. There are lots of different types of ants, and they feed on many different types of things here. And then the last thing we want to talk about in this section is biological magnification. And this is kind of a unique thing. Biological magnification is talking about the fact that when we humans put pesticides and poisons on our crops, we know that many of those poisoned crops are going to be eaten by insects anyway, and those insects ultimately will be eaten by birds. So let's think, and let's just keep the numbers low. Let's say we've got 10 grasshoppers, and they each get a little bit of the poison. Well, let's say one bird eats all of those 10 grasshoppers. And so that's going to get, the amount of poison will be magnified because what that little bit was in that one grasshopper, you've just increased it by 10, by a multitude, a function of 10, so you're multiplying it 10 times, and that's what goes into the bird's body. So the poisons or pesticides, some chemicals, and these are chemicals that tend to stay in the body, they're not just simply excreted throughout. They stay in the body and they build up in tissues. Like, there are a lot of poisons that build up in fats, a lot of chemicals that you don't sweat out or urinate out, they just build up in the fatty tissue especially, but they build up in these tissues and they don't leave. And as you go up the food pyramid, you know, that one bird eats a multitude of grasshoppers, and then that one, let's say that one coyote eats a multitude of birds, and so it just slowly builds up. The amount of chemical that's in one organism increases. So some chemicals stay in the body and build up at greater levels as you go up the pyramid, because animals eat multiple organisms. They just don't eat one grasshopper. They're going to eat multitudes of those grasshoppers. And this, in essence, magnifies the effect of the pesticide or whatever toxin or poison that you put on it. It might be that we have great reasons for putting the poisons on there, but that still doesn't negate the fact that they do have an impact on other organisms in the environment. At any point you need to pause this so you can catch up, then do so.